I want at this point to supplement these reflections by Newman on councils and their aftermaths with a striking point that Newman makes at the beginning of his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. In the first section of the first chapter, where he's speaking about the process of development in ideas, he points out that a living idea cannot be isolated from intercourse with the world around. But he argues that this intercourse is actually necessary, if, as he puts it, a great idea is duly to be understood, and much more if it is to be fully exhibited. In Newman's terminology, Christianity is just such an idea. Now, there is an obvious objection to the argument, namely, that the further anything moves from its source or origin, the more likely it is to lose its original character. Conceding that certainly there is always a risk of an idea being corrupted by external elements, Newman nevertheless insists that while it is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring, this is not true of the kind of ideas, that's to say, religious and philosophical ideas, that he is talking about. And I quote this very important passage in the essay. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image, that's to say, of the stream of the spring, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or belief, which on the contrary is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. It necessarily arises out of an existing state of things and for a time savors of the soil. Its vital element needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary. In other words, the philosophy or belief becomes more rather than less its true self as it changes or develops in time. And it is ironic that the famous words which appear in the conclusion to this section are regularly quoted out of context to mean the opposite of what Newman intended. In a higher world, and these words have been quoted during this conference, I don't mean in a bad way, but they were quoted, in a higher world it is otherwise, but here below to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. The point is not that Catholicism has to change or develop in order to be different, but in order to be the same, as the preceding sentence, which is never quoted, makes clear. It changes with them, that's the idea that Newman is talking about, with them, that is the external circumstances, in order to remain the same. Now, if Newman is correct in what he says about an idea such as a philosophy or belief becoming more equable and purer and stronger as it develops, then the teachings of Vatican II will become more equable and purer and stronger as time goes on. Those who participated in the Council no doubt thought that they understood perfectly well the meaning of its teachings. Both Professor Kuhn and Archbishop Lefebvre had no doubt in their minds about how the Council was to be understood, that is, as a rupture with tradition. And ironically, like Erlinger and Manning, were in close agreement about its significance. In retrospect, we can see much better the very limited scope of the definition of papal infallibility and appreciate the accuracy of Newman's interpretation. But for both Erlinger and Manning, the definition signified far more than Catholic theology has since understood it to mean, an understanding which received the Church's formal endorsement in the Constitution Lumen Gentium at Vatican II. In the case of the latter Council, it similarly suited both Kuhn and Lefebvre to exaggerate the revolutionary nature of the Council, even though the so-called revolution aroused in them very different feelings. It is appropriate to call Newman the father, if it is appropriate to call Newman the father of Vatican II, as I've said he is so often called, then it is not unreasonable to apply the many theology of councils which he adumbrated at the time of Vatican II, together with his theology of development, to the question of the reception and interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, as well as to likely future developments. Well, if we may take Newman as our guide, we may legitimately use that passage in the essay on development to argue that those who participated in or lived through the Second Vatican Council are less likely to understand the true meaning and significance of the Council's teaching than posterity. The idea of Vatican II, to use Newman's terminology, will, if Newman is correct, grow more equable and purer and stronger as the stream moves away from the spring and its bed has become deep and broad and full. Far from taking place in a historical void, the Second Vatican Council met at a time of enormous upheaval in Western society, a time of optimistic euphoria, but also a time in the West, at any rate, of great moral and spiritual devastation. It took place in a period of revolution and inevitably savoured the soil of the 1960s, of, to use Newman's words, the existing state of things of that decade. Consequently, its vital element, to use Newman's words, needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary. As I often like to say to people, Pope John XXIII unfortunately didn't realise when he called the council that he was calling the council in the 60s. After Vatican I, Newman constantly urged worried correspondence. Our duty is patience. A year after that council, he wrote in a private letter, "Our wisdom is to pray that he, who before now has completed a first council by a second, may do so now." Newman, of course, was praying not for another council that would extend and strengthen the definition of papal infallibility as the Ultramontanes would have liked, but for a council that would modify the definition by setting it in a larger perspective of fuller teaching of the Church. In our time, there has been no Vatican III that would have extended and strengthened the equivalent conciliar texts as the liberal wing of the Church would have liked. But rather, the popes from Paul VI to Benedict XVI have endeavoured to set the teachings of the Council in the wider perspective of the whole history and tradition of the Church, so the Council can be understood in continuity rather than rupture with the past. This brings us to the second kind of development that Newman speaks of in his mini theology of councils. For it is not only a question of the meaning and significance of the idea of Vatican II becoming more luminous as it is seen both in the light of the past and in the developing life of the Church, but there is also the consideration that councils open up further developments because of what they don't say or stress. In the case of Vatican I, Newman saw that the isolated teaching on the papacy and the lack of a general teaching on the Church would open up the kind of development, or must open up the kind of development that would reach fruition nearly a century later in the Lumen Gentium. The priorities similarly had to change after Vatican II, both because of unbalanced exaggerations of certain of its teachings and because of the emergence of new problems. This change, in fact, began to happen very soon after the Council. After only 9 years had elapsed, Pope Paul VI issued Evangelii Nunciandi in 1974, in which he called for a new evangelization, to use John Paul's term. Apart from the decree of the foreign missions, Vatican II was virtually silent on evangelization, which was, of course, to become the great theme of Pope John Paul II's pontificate. These two kinds of development have come together in wholly unexpected post-Vatican II phenomenon, a phenomenon which is vitally connected with the new evangelization, and which has received the support of Popes Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, very often in opposition to the teaching of the views of the local bishops. This new phenomenon exemplifies both the two kinds of Newmanian development that I have been speaking of. The rise of new ecclesial communities and movements, as they're called, some of which in fact predate the Council, on the one hand can be said to represent a response to what the Council failed or omitted to speak about, that is, particularly evangelization, and on the other hand, to make much clearer and more luminous those first two foundational chapters of Lumen Gentium, which I have argued must be the key text of the Council, by realizing in the concrete their real meaning and significance. For the whole point, one might say, about these new ecclesial communities and movements is precisely that they are not lay communities and movements, though they are often called such, but ecclesial communities and movements. They are ecclesial and lay, not lay, because they consist not only of lay members, but also of clergy, bishops, and religious or consecrated lay members. What is so significant is they bring together the baptized, whatever their particular status in the Church, into an organic communion,